Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this panel on reconciliation and forgiveness in the Catholic imagination. We have a remarkable assemblage of panelists here, and each one will speak from 12 to 15 minutes, and so I think we'll have some good time left for question and answer and interaction. I'd like to introduce each of the panelists, and then they will speak in that order. So first, Canon Sarah Snyder of the Rose Castle Foundation will speak on impossible friendships and risky reconciliation. She has worked for many years to promote faith-based reconciliation and is founding director of the Rose Castle Foundation, equipping the next generation of leaders to transform conflict within their spheres of influence. Previously, she served as the Archbishop of Canterbury's special advisor for reconciliation, supporting the Catholic Anglican Church to be an agent of peace in conflict and post-conflict context. She was director of partnerships at Religions for Peace International and directed the Cambridge University International Summer Schools for Muslim, Christian, and Jewish leaders from conflict zones. She began her career as a documentary producer for BBC television. During this time, she and her husband lived with the Tuareg nomads in the Sahara Desert, northern Mali, whilst filming a multimedia program for European schools. They also worked in places as diverse as Peru, South Africa, South Sudan, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. They also work, these intercultural and interfaith contexts have shaped their relational approach to reconciliation today. Professor Jason Springs of the University of Notre Dame will speak on Can Restorative Justice Transform Structural Violence? The case of U.S. mass incarceration. Jason Springs is professor of religion, ethics, and peace studies here at Notre Dame. He is interested particularly in ethical, philosophical, and religious dimensions of restorative justice, attending specifically to its potential to intervene in racialized and class dimensions of the U.S. prison industrial complex. His latest book, Restorative Justice and Lived Religion, Transforming Mass Incarceration in Chicago, examines the transformational power of restorative justice work conducted by a group of missionaries of the Precious Blood in one of the most violence-ridden neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago. Finally, Dr. Jacqueline Rivers of Harvard University and the Seymour Institute will speak on the road to justice and reconciliation, righting past wrongs. Jacqueline Rivers is the Executive Director and Senior Fellow for Social Science and Policy of the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies. She is currently a Senior Fellow at the King's College in New York City and has served as a lecturer in both sociology and African American studies at Harvard University. She has presented at Princeton University, the University of Notre Dame, the University of Pennsylvania, the Vatican, Stanford University, the United Nations, and in several other venues. So let's begin with Sarah Snyder.
Thank you so much, Dan, for convening us, and thank you all for getting up early on a Saturday morning, coming to be with us. The slogan of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission was Truth, the Road to Reconciliation. It has since been adopted and questioned as a model for handling transitional justice in conflicted parts of the world. But is it true that truth-telling brings about or contributes to reconciliation? TRCs have continued to play a key role in societies trying to move beyond a violent history. Yet the connection between truth and reconciliation remains questionable. For some, there is the legitimate fear that truth-telling does not lead to justice for all, or even for anyone. Rather, they might argue it is about forgive and forget, or ruling powers maintaining their own privileges. For others, talk of reconciliation is premature. It's just too soon for a society to honestly face and admit the wrongs of the past, especially when they continue into the present. In John's Gospel, we read of a face-to-face conversation with Jesus in which Pilate asks him somewhat sarcastically, What is truth? Pilate said to him, "So, you're a king." Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." Pilate asked, "What is truth?" The irony of Pilate's question is sometimes missed. He was the Roman governor of Judea, representative of Emperor Tiberius. And before him, in his palace, was a wounded prisoner who was, we believe, the embodiment of truth, the Messiah, God incarnate. Something about Jesus had sparked his curiosity, even a desire to explore truth itself. Whilst Pilate ended up washing his hands of Jesus, I wonder what might have happened if they had both pursued his line of questioning. The question, what is truth, lies at the heart of questioning itself. Like an engaged student, to fully seek what is true, not what we want to be true, we ask open questions, listen actively, research, explore different perspectives, and push status quo boundaries in honest and respectful wonder. The truth can be, in fact, often is, uncomfortable. But if we genuinely seek it, we must be prepared for discomfort and ready to embrace it. Rather than rely on others' truths, like our Google profile or favorite media, we might also wonder, how does God in all his fullness see this or that, rather than how do I see it? In John's Gospel, Jesus reminds us that God gave his Holy Spirit to prompt us towards truth again and again. "I have much more to say to you," says Jesus, "more than you can now bear. But when the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all truth." Exploring all the truth beyond what we now know is a risky endeavor. In one of her letters, Flannery O'Connor reminds us that the truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it emotionally. There are long periods in the lives of us all when the truth as revealed by faith is hideous, emotionally disturbing, downright repulsive, she writes. In his book on orthodoxy, G.K. Chesterton warned against staying too safe in our exploration of that truth, which he terms orthodoxy. People, he writes, have fallen into a foolish habit of speaking of orthodoxy as something humdrum and safe. There never was anything so perilous or so exciting as orthodoxy. Seeking truth includes uncovering and disclosing shameful, painful, and traumatic facts that people try hard to conceal from others and from themselves. For many, the wounds are just too raw and too deep to expose. The Greek word for trauma means wound. For example, in Luke's account of the Good Samaritan who bandaged the wounds of the fallen traveler. And the Greek for reconciliation means healing what is broken, referenced by St. Paul in Romans and his second letter to the Corinthians. So the connection between trauma and reconciliation, etymologically and in reality, I believe, includes healing the wounds of the past and also of the present and the potential future. How then do truth and reconciliation commissions, with their encouragement to tell truths of the past, contribute to a future journey towards healing and reconciliation? Well, the journey begins by acknowledging and naming what is wrong, honestly exposing suffering and injustice in order to seek repair and restoration, or even the righting of wrong relationships for the very first time. Denying or ignoring injustice and its consequences plays no part in the reconciliation journey. Rather, it's a recipe for ongoing retaliation and retribution. in communities where former victims and perpetrators have to live together, such as in South Africa, Rwanda, and elsewhere, recognition of wrongdoing and suffering is essential to any future-oriented societal aspiration. In South Africa, it took the moral authority and leadership of Desmond Tutu to reconcile traumatized South Africans to the very idea of a reconciliation journey. Tutu saw the act of reconciliation as an act of atonement or at-one-ment, acknowledging and confessing wrongdoing as a necessary condition for rebuilding trust in a future nation. Truth-telling by the perpetrators of violence was understood as a form of confession, even with the dubious political carrot of receiving immunity from punishment in exchange for their testimony. As Tutu made clear, nobody is immune from their accountability to God. And along with confession is an invitation, not a demand, to forgive. Forgiveness, I would suggest, understood as a victim's choice to let go of their just right for retribution. It does not mean forgive and forget. I'll say it again. Forgiveness is choosing to forego our just right for retribution. And beyond that, the choice to actively pursue repair and restoration of what went wrong. This is what God does for us, and it is what Christ asked us to do for others. We forgive as we too are forgiven. It is one of the hardest steps towards reconciliation, but without it, reconciliation is almost impossible. One of our South African alumni and colleagues, Candice Mama, discovered her father had been brutally murdered, burned alive, by the notorious police colonel Eugene de Kock, nicknamed Prime Evil. Whilst he was subsequently imprisoned, Candice's mental and physical health was severely impacted over the following 16 years, effectively imprisoning her also, despite her physical freedom. During the TRC process, she and her mother were offered an opportunity to meet Eugene in prison. After months of uncertainty, they decided to go. The prisoner they met was quite unlike the image Candice held in her head. He was stooped, elderly, and undernourished. When he asked for their forgiveness, she asked him if he was able to forgive himself, at which point he broke down. The vulnerability they shared in that brief moment was enough, in that case, to turn the tide of hatred. She told us subsequently, "I had forgiven him then, but I can now say after many more years, I have also been changed forever by that encounter." She wrote an open letter to the TRC saying, "I believe in order to fulfill the vision of the greats, like Nelson Mandela, we have to go through the reconciliation process as a country, because there can be no progress without reconciliation." To give one other example, the Catholic Church in Canada has acknowledged its role in the abuse that took place within residential schools for Indigenous communities, abuse that was real and painful and leaves deep scars. This shocking history is an ever-present reminder to all Canadian Catholics, in fact all Canadians, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, of how the Church failed to live up to the gospel and instead assisted an assimilationist policy that continues to impact First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Canadians. The Church and Pope Francis have subsequently offered their apology, and although this is just a first step, unraveling the truth and acknowledging wrongdoing is an essential part of the reconciliation journey from past to present to future. So I'm just going to very briefly share a glimpse of our Rose Castle Foundation pedagogy, shaped after decades working on the front lines of violence, from remembering the past to rehumanizing the present and reimagining the future. As human beings, we naturally try to make sense of the present through referencing the past and anticipating a future of some kind. We never forget the past, That's not the purpose of reconciliation, nor is it to push our memories under the carpet. We inevitably include other characters in our remembering, good and bad. We tell their story for them in ways that fit with our own. And when I say story, I'm not talking about made-up narratives. Rather, I'm referencing the way we piece together the actual milestones of our past to create a meaningful account of what happened. Protestants in Belfast, for example, tell us that during the Troubles, the role of the British Army was to protect everyone. Not so, say many Catholics. Their own relationship with the British was, to say the least, lacking in trust in both directions. Their remembering was different to that of their Protestant neighbours, despite living in the same city and witnessing, however differently, the same troubles. When we tell the stories of our so-called enemies instead of listening to them, when we stop looking them in the eye, stop seeing their face, we create our own image of them and relate to that image instead. We often focus on several aspects of their character or behavior, which eventually become the entirety of our picture of them. We forget their full humanity. In many ways, we dehumanize them, deface them, replacing them with our own mask of who we think they are. In contexts of war, the enemy can often be described by the name of an animal, cockroach, snake, making it easier for reasonable human beings to perpetrate violence against them. We forget, perhaps, that God cares about our enemies just as much as he cares about us, unless, of course, we have such a highly inflated view of ourselves. Jesus challenged us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. Sometimes the enemy we find hardest to love is, in fact, the one within ourselves. The rehumanizing that is needed at the heart of reconciliation is not only of others, it's also of ourselves. Our ability to love others is deeply connected to our ability to love ourselves as God loves us. I wonder if Jesus was onto something when he reminded us not only to love God, love our neighbor, and love our enemies, but all along to love ourselves, the enemy within. Which takes us to our final R, reimagining. Reimagining the future in light of our own and others' narratives. Recognizing the wider consequences of broken relationship and imagining a future in which all play a part. Ourselves, our neighbors, our enemies, and everyone impacted by the unhealthy conflict we are living out. Truth and reconciliation is grounded in this idea that confronting the past is necessary to move from conflict to peace, hostility to hospitality. It is a restorative justice approach, not one of retributive or adversarial justice. It demands the presence of truth-telling, remembering the past more fully, acknowledging and naming wrongdoing, and actively seeking future transformation, restoration, reparation. It means doing the hard work of questioning, researching, and listening beyond our comfort zones and our echo chambers. Pontius Pilate asked Jesus one of life's greatest and most difficult questions: what is truth? Perhaps we too can ask him that same question and linger a little longer to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a tough act to follow. Beautifully done, beautifully said. Thank you. My remarks touch on four things. I'll begin with a controversy among contemporary restorative justice practitioners over the ability or alleged inability of restorative justice to transform systemic injustices, with specific attention to the context of U.S. mass incarceration. 2, I'll briefly describe why I think the capacity of restorative justice to address systemic injustice depends on conceptualizing it holistically and thereby understanding and developing its distinctive moral and spiritual dynamics. And 3, I will conclude by gesturing to how this discussion relates to the organizing theme of today's conference, that is, enriching and expanding Catholic imagination. As an addendum 4, I will suggest or gesture to a specific path by which those interested in the argument and possibilities I describe might further explore and pursue the ideas and assertions I set forth here. 1, the controversy. Some current practitioners and thinkers argue that restorative justice cannot address more than repair of interpersonal relationships and harms. They acknowledge that it can repair damaged relationships and cultivate new, more stable, positive relationships that, when practiced as measures that divert from standard paths through the criminal legal process, it can mitigate or remove the state from deciding who to punish and how, that it can reject the concept that punishment is a worthwhile purpose to begin with, and that it can center the situation on reducing and repairing harms through building trust, through truth-telling, concerted listening, in processes that directly involve the people who were in relationships with all the individuals and are in relationships with all the individuals impacted by wrongdoing and harm, and with the community as well. These are all good things, these critics suggest. However, none of these alternative responses do anything to actually name the injustices internal to the criminal legal system itself, nor to challenge and change them. They do not address the structurally racist and classist dimensions of the punitive orientation of the criminal legal system embodied, for example, in the school-to-prison pipeline or the new Jim Crow. They do not name and challenge the generational poverty, lack of access to basic goods like quality health care and education, and all forms of structural racism that marginalized communities must confront across the United States in particular. Thus, while restorative justice is a helpful and powerful tool, the argument runs, restorative justice does nothing to challenge and change what we've come to call the U.S. prison industrial complex itself. As a result, truly transforming systemic injustice and structural violence requires inventing an altogether different form of justice, what some have come to call transformative justice. On one hand, I think that the intuition driving this argument gets something deeply correct. As the peace builder John Paul Lederach points out, it is possible to address and even to solve a problem or problems, and yet not really do anything to change things, and especially not alter the causes and conditions of the problem in question, and therefore the likelihood that similar problems will reoccur. Relationships never occur in a vacuum. They are always interwoven with the relational contexts in which those relationships occur. And so to address the relationships without addressing the relational contexts, and thus the social, economic, political histories and legacies that are always already in place, even if in the background, in any given practical context of relationality, is to address and even solve problems, but perhaps not to change anything, not change the forms of structural and cultural violence that give rise to the kind of problems that restorative justice is often implemented to address. At the same time, and in contrast to those who portray restorative justice as strictly interpersonal and concerned to repair harms and reconstruct prior conditions and then call for an altogether different model of transformative justice, I'd like to offer some reasons for thinking that the capacity to intervene in and counter structural and cultural violence and systemic injustice is actually intrinsic to restorative justice when it is holistically understood and practiced. More specifically, I suggest that so conceived and practiced, restorative justice has the capacity to transform structural and cultural violence in and through the cultivation of healthy and just relationships, rather than as an adjunct after or separate from the cultivation of such relationships. The central thing I'd like to convey is that a holistic approach to restorative justice can be a theory of justice and form concrete justice practices only because it fosters moral and spiritual forms of association between people. This approach is holistic because it rejects the view that restorative justice is best understood as a tool in a toolkit that might help to mediate individual or group conflicts. Instead, it recognizes that restorative justice is a framework, a way to help envision and cultivate an integrated restorative approach to individual agency, life together in community, and society more broadly. When thought of in this way, we can see restorative justice embodied in a range of purposeful and ethical practices reflecting dynamics of lived, everyday, moral and spiritual sensibilities. How so? These dynamics are moral in that they're characterized by mutual recognition, reciprocal respect, critical empathy, compassion, and critical caretaking, mutual caretaking. Accountability for destructive conflict on this approach aims to repair harms, address needs, and heal. This concept of accountability strives to honor the dignity and promote the flourishing of all the people involved in a given circumstance and context. From the perspective of a holistic approach to restorative justice, U.S. mass incarceration is at its heart a spiritual crisis. It's a crisis of meaning, value, and identity that calls into question the identity or character, the ethos, or the spirit of the culture, caused by the deep historical devaluing, dehumanizing, and domination of minority, marginalized people and poor people, and communities of all colors. This crisis is spiritual, relationally speaking, in that U.S. mass incarceration destroys the relationships and broader communal bonds that people depend upon for their well-being and flourishing. The relational dynamics of restorative justice practices, holistically understood, are spiritual in that they respond to these spiritual dimensions of the crisis of U.S. mass incarceration. The practices aim to cultivate relationships that recognize and nurture mutual independence among neighbors, community members, and fellow citizens. These dynamics promote individual agency and self-reliance, but do so by simultaneously fostering acknowledgement of and just response to each person's indebtedness to the relationships and communities that are integral to their well-being and flourishing. It's a concept that ethicists and theologians have long referred to as piety. They facilitate forms of intentional meaning-making. They cultivate individual self-worth and shared community value. They help develop forms of individual and collective agency. They fortify community resources that cut against the shaming, silencing, and scapegoating, the meaningless and despair, forms of nihilism, community fragmentation and marginalization perpetrated by the racist and classist structural and cultural violence of the U.S. prison industrial complex. How does this relate, expand, and enrich Catholic imagination, you might ask? Well, the short answer I'll offer today, in a few minutes I have remaining, is to look and see. The moral and spiritual dynamics I describe here, I encountered in my many years of field work across the south and west sides of Chicago, in which over the past 10 years I investigated the capacity of restorative justice practices and initiatives to transform the systemic injustices, structural and cultural violence shot throughout U.S. mass incarceration, in particular how these manifest across the city of Chicago. One of the communities I discovered there that most explicitly both modeled in their practice and articulated explicitly this holistic model of restorative justice is a community center in back of the yards, referred to as the Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation. It's a group of missionaries of the Precious Blood Order that launched a community center there in 2002 that has become a restorative justice community hub, most fundamentally practicing restorative justice as the cultivation of just, healthy, and sustainable relationships, and through this intentionally and purposefully naming, resisting, and yet working to transform the classist and racialized forms of systemic injustices and forms of structural violence that assert themselves throughout the neighborhood there, the broader community, and the city of Chicago. This is a radical endeavor I discovered, that expands Catholic imagination, in my view, precisely because the precious blood missionaries that have gone into this community that was once historically filled with numerous Catholic churches and other religious organizations that one by one, over time, abandoned the area. Their ministry is driven by sustained engagement and oriented by the experiences of the local neighborhood people. Their approach is innovative and improvisational, and itself embodies an expansion of Catholic imagination in and through the conceptualization and implementation of restorative justice that intentionally speaks of and aims to address transformatively systemic injustices through the cultivation of just and sustainable relationships. I'm right at the limit of my time. Finally, fourthly, I targeted for 12, so while I don't have a great deal of time to substantiate or offer concrete examples, what I have described above conceptually and gestured to in terms of a concrete example that is especially powerful. But by way of gesturing toward a path forward for any who would like to further explore and concretely investigate these ideas, and while I would never explicitly desire to crassly ply my own wares, I will do so nonetheless, and point any with interest to a book I've written based on these 10 years of field work I did across the city of Chicago, which appeared just about 4 weeks ago. It's entitled Restorative Justice and Lived Religion, Transforming Mass Incarceration in Chicago. I welcome you all into the conversation. Thank you.
So I would very much like to thank Dan for organizing this panel and for allowing me to participate in it. Thank my fellow panelists and all of you who are here with us today. So I want to confess, first of all, I'm not a Catholic. I'm a Black Pentecostal, but I really wanted to think about this idea of the Catholic imagination and how it might speak to the issue of reconciliation and of justice. And I was drawn to the title of an encyclical by Benedictine XVI, and Caritas in Veritate, Love in Truth. And truth has been very much discussed by the previous speakers, so I hope that you will find this an interesting perspective on it. Now, Caritas in Veritate is actually encyclical about development, so you might say, what? Where does this? But I found in it nuggets of truth that I thought would really apply here, because it speaks to some of the key qualities that we need in the face of extreme polarization in the United States. Pope Benedictine says that what is called for is not just love in interpersonal relationships, but love in macro relationships, as he puts it. And he says, in Christ, charity in truth becomes the face of Christ's person, a vocation for us to love our brothers and sisters in the truth of his plan. Indeed, he himself is the truth. And he is making this point that this is not just about how we interact as individuals, but that it's at relations across all levels of society, across class lines, across racial lines, as he puts it, in the social, juridical, cultural, political, and economic fields in the very way society is structured. He goes on to say the truth gives meaning and value to love. God is both logos and caritas, both truth and love. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. John tells us that God is love. Pope Benedictine says, charity needs to be understood, confirmed, and practiced in the light of love. Love based on a falsehood, on a fantasy, it makes me think of one of my reactions to a lot of rom-coms, where in these romantic comedies, one person is caught in an inadvertent lie, misunderstood. I'm not really the person you think I am, but I've so fallen in love with you, I can't tell you the truth. And at the end, when the person says, I've really been lying to you this entire time, it's fine. The fact that you just lied to me the entire time I've known you, it does not transform my understanding of you or our relationship. But Pope Francis says the opposite is true. That if we do not know the truth of a situation, we can't really exercise love. Without truth, we can do whatever we want and call it love. He goes on to say that truth overcomes subjective opinions. And I quote again, truth by enabling men and women to let go of their subjective opinions and impressions allows them to move beyond cultural and historical limitations and to come together. And yet this love never lacks justice. Charity goes beyond justice, because to love is to give back, to offer what is mine to the other, but it never lacks justice, which prompts us to give the other what is his, what is due to her, by reason of her being or her acting. We must first complete justice to act in true love. And so there's this tension between justice and forgiveness, between reconciliation and forgiveness are costly. And I think we heard that in Canon Snyder's talk this morning. They're very expensive because but as expensive as we are, we have to be ready to forgive. The Bible points us in this direction. In Hebrews 9:22, it says, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Forgiveness is expensive. God himself required extreme justice, the complete ultimate sacrifice of his own son, in order to provide forgiveness for us. It says in 1 Peter 3:18, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. So when we talk about forgiveness and reconciliation, we have to bear in mind the extreme price that the forgiveness we enjoy cost, and be ready to pay a similar price if we're really going to achieve forgiveness and reconciliation, which is so lacking right now as we are on the eve of probably the most contentious election that the United States has known. Jesus commands us to have a forgiving spirit. He says, for if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins, in Matthew 6:14. So as costly as it is, we are commanded to practice this kind of forgiveness. I'll skip some of the other things because I see I only have, I'm running out of time. So what would justice look like that would permit forgiveness in the US today? I'll try to go quickly through this, but I want to say that a study in 2022 from the Carnegie Endowment found that the United States is unique in wealthy, long-established democracies and experiencing over an extended period of time what they call pernicious polarization. Pernicious polarization is when society is divided into two warring sections, not literally necessarily with guns, but deep-seated conflict, really seeing the world completely differently. Interestingly enough, I'm a Jamaican, my brother's Jamaican, and he sees this American election, because America has this enormous impact overseas. Whoever sits in the White House promotes in third world countries whatever their particular brand of cultural imperialism is. And so it has this enormous impact. So he watches the US election more closely than I do. But we see completely differently because we believe different sources. And so this society is deeply divided. And one of the causes that the Carnegie Foundation found was important in creating pernicious polarization was racial division or a demographic shift. But I want to focus on this issue of race. Michael Tesler, in his book Post-Racial or Most Racial, documented the reaction to the Obama presidency, that people associated issues related to Obama with his race. For example, healthcare. So when they did experiments in which some of the provisions of Obamacare were presented to people and they were asked, do you approve of this? Now, what they did was, in some cases, they presented this as related to Obama's healthcare proposals, and in other cases, they presented these very same proposals as being related to Bill Clinton's healthcare proposals a decade earlier. And even though these were identical proposals, they were more negatively received by white people when they were associated with Obama. So and this was more true the more racial resentment people indicated they had. So the more feeling that minorities are taking over, I'm losing ground because of what's happening with affirmative action, that kind of feeling, whoever had that strongly, was more likely to show a difference in terms of proposals that were related to Obama. He also found that blacks and whites became more divided on issues during the Obama presidency, that blacks and whites sorted into political parties by race. So blacks identified more strongly with being Democratic as a result of the presidency, and whites identified more strongly with being Republicans as a result of Obama's presidency. In addition to that, people sorted more into liberal and conservative camps in terms of their position on race, and more racially conservative people became more Republican. So even though among white people, if you were more racially conservative, you identified more strongly as Republican, and even if you were white, if you were open on racial issues, you identified more strongly as being Democratic. Support for Democratic parties, Democratic candidates, black and white Democrats, support for them shrank among racially resentful whites. To quote Tesler, mass politics had become more polarized by racial attitudes since Barack Obama's rise to prominence. Racially liberal and racially conservative Americans were more divided over a whole host of political positions. So I just want to remind us, race is playing this huge role. I don't want to suggest it's a primary role. Tesler admits that this is only one of the things that contributes to polarization in the United States, but race is one of the ugly truths that Canon Snyder talked about that Americans have not confronted. There's been no racial reconciliation commission, no truth and reconciliation commission around the racial injustice that has happened in this country. Slavery, I know it was more than 150 years ago, but African Americans were freed with no compensation, contrary to the biblical command in Deuteronomy 15:12-15. I won't read it. Sharecropping. Black people, which followed on the heels of slavery, black people were deprived of the profits they should have made from their crops. They were cheated with the supplies that were provided to them. In the New Deal, even though this created the American middle class, it largely excluded black people from the benefits of Social Security and unemployment insurance at the time. Very few of the benefits that flowed from the GI Bill flowed to black people. Redlining followed on the heels of that. the source of wealth in the United States, home ownership. Black people were denied. They weren't allowed to buy homes. They didn't have access to mortgages because of redlining, which came from the Federal Housing Authority. I'd like to remind you the federal government played a role in this. This was systemic, structural, not simply interpersonal, resulting in low rates of home ownership, deteriorating housing because they couldn't access home loans, home improvement loans, and whites in the meantime benefited from compounding value of home ownership. It's not just that they started out like this, it's that over time the gap grew as the value of white homes increased and blacks didn't have homes, and those who did have homes, the value didn't keep up at the same rate. Currently, the inequality and disadvantage is baked in. So black people, because of all of this, all of the paths that I just described, sedimentation of inequality, according to Shapiro and Oliver and Shapiro. Because of this compounding inequality, blacks are trapped in poor neighborhoods with terrible schools. So the very root out of their situation is denied to a lot of black people because they don't develop the skills that make them truly competitive in a skills-biased labor market. So what can we do? I think the first and most important thing, I want to go back to Caritas in Veritate, prayer. Most important thing for us to be doing as Christians is to be praying about the polarization, and to be praying about the racial division in the country. I want to also draw on this idea of truth and listening. We need to be learning. If we're going to know the truth, it's only by listening to each other. We need to be investigating and studying. We need to know for ourselves and from reputable sources, not the YouTube videos that my brother watches. We need to be going to trustworthy sources to really confront the racial history of this country, as ugly as it is, to know the good, the truth, and the good, the ugly, and the bad. We need to listen across difference. And we need to work on what do we do to put it right. A very challenging thing in our current polarized situation, but I want to close again by encouraging us to pray, by quoting from Pope Benedict. As is also affirmed in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, from this account of Jacob wrestling with God, the spiritual tradition of the Church has retained the symbol of prayer as a battle of faith and as a triumph of perseverance. The Bible text speaks to us about a long night of seeking God, of the struggle to learn his name and see his face. It is a night of prayer that with tenacity and perseverance, ask God for a blessing and a new name, a blessing to end the polarization, to right the racial injustice, a new reality that is full and that is a fruit of conversion and forgiveness. And forgive me for referring to Pope Benedict inaccurately earlier. Thank you.
Well, these are three very hard acts to follow, all good friends and colleagues who working. So I think there's a wonderful convergence in the panel on topics and ideas. And I realized I forgot to introduce myself. So just briefly, I'm a professor of political science here at Notre Dame. Relevant to this panel, I'm the author of Just and Unjust Peace, An Ethic of Reconciliation. And currently writing a book that sets forth a political theology based on a Christian concept of justice that I'll speak about in a few minutes. I've also promoted reconciliation as an activist in Kashmir and the Great Lakes region of Africa. So not a day seems to go by when we do not hear about polarization. I think something's happening in a couple days. I can't quite remember what it is. The term seems hackneyed. Yet that we are polarized is no less true for the concept being hackneyed. More likely, it is so commonplace because it is so true. And days before our national election, and fears that dispute over the results of the election will follow the election itself, we cannot and must not stop talking about polarization. Almost as often as we hear talk about polarization, we hear some of the same proposals for overcoming or at least mitigating polarization. Stop demonizing one another, engage in reasoned discourse, practice civility, be a bridge builder, practice genuine listening, reconciliation, work together on things we can agree on. We are told that after the recent hurricane storm in western North Carolina, progressive people in Asheville came together with Appalachian MAGA people to provide relief to victims and mutual mercy. It's kind of heartwarming. Here at Notre Dame, Father John Jenkins made civility a major theme of his presidency. Here at Notre Dame, we would practice civility and we would promote civility in the country at large. Our new president, Father Bob Dowd, proposed in his recent inaugural address that Notre Dame make bridge building its mission. Most of the examples he gave for building bridges involved working with others to reduce poverty and violence. If we cannot agree, we are told, we can at least reason together and treat one another as citizens, as fellow human beings, and the like. And as is the case with the diagnosis of polarization, these proposals for mitigating polarization are no less true, profound, and important for being repeated often. Yet I think proposals for overcoming polarization and reconciliation, as one who has been involved with these things for a quarter century, too easily overlook the non-negotiability of justice, principles that, if we hold them to be right and true, cannot be put aside or compromised in building bridges, listening, finding common ground, and the like. Apart from justice, these strategies risk being cheap, something like the cheap discipleship of which German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote, contrasting it to costly discipleship, the sort that led him to oppose the Nazi regime actively and to pay for it with his life. A quick look at history's great reconcilers shows that they did not compromise in their stand for justice, and that some of them lost their lives for this pursuit. Take, for instance, President Abraham Lincoln. In his earliest speeches, he made clear that slavery was unjust, a violation of natural law, and a contradiction of the nation's founding principles, and that the nation could not endure were it not abolished. He is famous for rejecting Senator Stephen Douglas's argument that the issue be left to the states, very much a proposal for bridge building, pluralism, mitigating conflict. While Lincoln's politics involved strategic choices and his strategy of sequencing, as his commentators often like to point out, he never lost sight of and did not compromise his goals of ending slavery and securing everyone's natural rights. Or consider Martin Luther King and his civil rights campaign. Remember his famous argument from the letter from Birmingham jail, "Justice cannot wait," and his famous words, "Wait means never." Casual readers of the letter might miss that he was addressing his arguments not to hardened racists, but rather to the white moderate pastors, those who were telling him to slow down so as not to be so, what? Polarizing? Demonizing? King would not compromise until his goal of equal rights was met. The same goes for Pope John Paul II in his quest against communism. His strategy contrasted markedly with what had been the Vatican's predominant approach to the Eastern Bloc, which was to negotiate with these regimes so as to preserve the freedom of the church under governments that were deemed semi-permanent. A key part of this strategy was to avoid criticizing the regimes for their ideology, that is, to demonize them. Pope John Paul II, though, took the argument to the regimes, making 3 pilgrimages to Poland, and to insist publicly that human rights and the freedom and dignity of the person could not be compromised. His goal was that the Cold War would be ended, not merely managed. In 1989, the Polish regime fell and sparked off a chain reaction that ended communist regimes in 27 countries. Another example is the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. Most famous are its leaders, Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela. Both campaigned against apartheid and refused negotiations or compromise short of ending apartheid and realizing a regime that guaranteed human rights and racial equality. Mandela, of course, spent 27 years in prison for his stance. So we see that these kind of great reconcilers, people we teach in our schools and put on our walls and so forth, were also people who uncompromisingly fought for justice, and often fought more uncompromisingly than the people who held a message that was something more like bridge building or discourse or pluralism or the like. Yet for each of these figures, the justice of human rights, their adherence to its truth, and their uncompromising stance for it did not exhaust their approach, and is not alone what made them great reconcilers. They also sought unity and held out their hands to their opponents. Lincoln called for forgiveness, charity, and the healing of wounds towards the Confederate States, and abjured the self-righteousness of many Northerners, not least preachers, who loudly preached only the South's injustice. Lincoln held instead that the Civil War was God's judgment on the entire nation for a sin in which all were complicit. Martin Luther King practiced nonviolence and love of enemies and called for a beloved country and succeeded in changing the attitudes of millions. John Paul II also practiced nonviolence, wielded spiritual power, mobilized popular protest, and forewent condemnation of deposed leaders. He even forgave his own assassin. Mandela practiced love toward his jailers while in prison, and both practiced and abdicated forgiveness and reconciliation amidst and after apartheid's fall. Tutu led in the same themes. In other words, these figures were uncompromising in their stance for human rights that they held to be true, while also practicing principles such as forgiveness, nonviolence, and love for enemies that invited healing, conversion, and unity. Now, we might be inclined to say that they campaigned uncompromisingly for justice, while also engaging nobly and charitably in practices that were designed to unify and to stitch a divided world back together. Justice plus, if you will. My dispute with this position is not to deny the importance of either kind of principle, but rather to that which we should call one justice and the other something extra that turns out to be less important. After all, philosophers from Plato to John Rawls have hailed justice as the central public political virtue and principle. So if a principle is not justice, then it is likely to be sidelined as private, personal, religious, and optional. What I want to argue instead is that both human rights and principles such as forgiveness and love for enemies and opponents are commonly part of justice. Justice is holistic. Reconciliation is indeed the best broad term for a holistic and comprehensive justice. So in the final portion of my talk, I would like to explain briefly what I mean by justice. And this is what I'm arguing in the book that I am writing, tentatively entitled Resurrecting Justice. What is justice? Well, for many centuries now, Westerners have answered the constant will to render another his due. This way of thinking about justice comes from Greek and Roman thought and has been enshrined by Western philosophers. Due, I argue, is the equivalent of rights. When we realize this, we can see all the more how dominant this notion of justice is. Rights are at the center of Western political philosophy and political discourse in the West. They are also the central concept in constitutions, which virtually every country in the world possesses. The justice of rendering due, however, has included a different way of thinking about justice that comes to us from the Jewish Christian tradition, communicated in the Bible. What justice means here is the entirety of ways in which humans are to live, the entirety of commands that are taught. I call this the justice of right relationship, to signify all dimensions of human relationship that are to be lived. If it appears strange to readers of the Bible to say that this is justice, I submit that this is because English Bibles translate words that signify comprehensive right relationship as righteousness as well as justice. And so it's hidden behind the term righteousness. These words are primarily the Hebrew tzedek or tzedakah in the Old Testament and the Greek dikaiosune in the New Testament. Both mean comprehensive right relationship of the entirety of ways that God commands that humans follow. If they were all to be translated as justice, then the broad and comprehensive meaning of justice would be much more apparent. This is not an idle proposal, but a practice of translation that has already been employed. The Latin Vulgate, history's most influential translation of the Bible, renders almost all of these terms as justitia, or a close variant such as justitium, which translate readily into the English justice. If justice is comprehensive right relationship, I argue, it includes both obligations that are due or fulfill rights, as well as ones that do not correspond to rights and exceed what is due. The Bible describes both divine justice, the actions of God, and human justice, the actions that God enjoins for humans. Divine justice involves this blend of due and not due. The Apostle Paul describes God's saving action in the cross and resurrection as dikaiosune, translatable as justice, which he describes as a gift given to us while we were still sinners, precisely that we did not get our due or what was deserved. Yet in another sense, the same saving action paid our debt or what was due. It was a combination of due and more than due. The same goes for commandments for humans. Some, such as the commandment not to kill or to lie, correspond to the rights of others, to life or truth. Rights protect human dignity and dimensions of it. Other commandments, though, are not due in the sense that they are open-ended. Mercy, gift, generosity, hospitality, love for enemies, reconciliation, peace-building, nonviolence, and care for the poor. Forgiveness contrasts most with the justice of due, in that it means precisely foregoing the debt of retribution. Broadly, the beyond due commandments serve to heal and to restore wounds. Societies need both dimensions of justice, the part that renders due and that which is beyond due, comprehensive right relationship. This justice is equivalent to the biblical notion of reconciliation, which I interpret as the restoration of right relationship to a state of right relationship. It is a justice that includes that which is due, but is far wider. And this is what I see in each of the four figures that I outlined. One who fought uncompromisingly for the justice of rights, but also engaged in practices that went beyond due, that served to heal, to unify, to address wounds. That this justice describes the response to injustice practiced by the four figures that I discussed just earlier, uncompromising of rights and also involving other actions that bring about right relationship. All of this is justice. This justice is equivalent to the restorative justice that Jason Springs has described, not only as a response to individual actions and persons, but also to the systemic racism that lies behind mass incarceration, and that Sarah Snyder made the case for in her speaking about the importance of truth-telling and costliness in reconciliation, taught by the Rose Castle Foundation, exemplified in South Africa and Canada, and that Jackie Rivers argued for in her case for forgiveness and the central importance of truth and costliness. It is a justice that proposes to heal and unify, not by compromising rights, but by combining the quest for rights with practices that restore wounds. It is an arduous justice realized in the long term, but the only kind that can genuinely overcome polarization. Thank you. Well, good. I think we have some time for Q&A, and you can just address your question to, probably best to one, so that we can keep the question shorter and have more time for questions. But if you want to ask a general question, you could do that too. Yeah, Eugene Rivers.
I'll address this to Jay.
Okay.
Keep it simple. One of the things that strikes me, and the presentations are excellent. A+, 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 A+. How should we think, in view of all that's been said, how should we think about where the church is in relationship to January 6th? Because one of the things that was striking to me at the time, very focused question. I'm in a restaurant, my daughter calls, she's a social justice, warrior of the household, but Daddy, they're war. Yes, sweetie, I know. Yes, sweetie, I know. I'm busy, sweetie, I gotta go. No, Dad, it's no joke. These people are moving on the Capitol building and it is war. So I go to a blue collar kind of deli, and so they don't watch CNN, right? It's all hot, right? So I say, fellas, for the record, please, right? So they turn to the thing, I hope the thing's going nuts. How should we think about the extraordinary silence across the board? All of the religious leadership, all of it, nothing. Right? And I raise this in view of all that you folks have said. And I said, how do we, as gospel people, leadership, how did we sit by, see all of this? Right? Now, when the black kids cut up and they were doing their Black Lives Matter thing, everybody had something to say. Say amen, y'all. Everybody had something to say. Yet, when this happens, there is no responsibility accepted by the head of state or the government. And through all of that, the churches were silent.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we all talk about the importance of truth, and that reconciliation without truth is like trying to ride a bike without a frame or a seat. I mean, it's and that seems to be so disputed, but yet it's unavoidable. Is first telling the truth about what happened. I mean, I see it as denying the results of election, which is the most fundamental foundation of democracy. In fact, elections are democracy's expression of nonviolence, right? And if we're not going to respect the results, we don't have the very possibility of politics.
But the church society was uniform.
Yeah, the church. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah. Yeah.
I was just going to comment on the kind of, well, first of all, what I was going to say is someone who represented the Anglican Church in situations of conflict, there is absolutely no answer to what you say other than complete remorse. The church absolutely should be standing up and speaking out in these situations. What I was going to say was I'm interested in the separation of church and state here, which as a member of the Church of England, we don't have the same separation. In fact, the Archbishop of Canterbury is in the House of Lords and speaks regularly outwardly against these kinds of things. I wonder if the fear is that the church is somehow not allowed to speak about political polarization. And yet, if we take the meaning of the word politics, it's life. So, of course, the church has a huge amount to say about political division, just as it has a huge amount to say about any form of human experience. So, I just wanted to share remorse.
I agree. This is, I think, the multi-billion-dollar question, the uniformity of the silence in response to this. I think the proper response would be uniform remorse. I don't know the plausibility of that, and my reason for thinking that is because I think the question, when you sit with it, it may call us to awareness of how the degree to which the church, if we speak in such, is in many ways complicit in the very dynamics out of which this event is a symptom. And that may be somewhat active complicity through certain forms of nationalist appropriation of religious identity and practices, but it can also be a form of complicity that takes an ambivalence or a refusal to act and speak and testify to the truth in this particular moment, because it is baffling and it's atrocious, really, is what it is. And so repentance would be the initial response in the wake of what has happened, I think. But then, it's like, it's like one of my favorite restorative justice thinkers says, apology has to be doing sorry. You have to do it, right? So it's not just a profession of repentance, but then what do we do differently? How do we change? And so this is what I think would need to happen. Now, I can think, I think when I want to think of some of the better moments or things that I kind of hang my hope on, for instance, in response to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, right? Countless clergy across the church came together and organized and marched and acted preemptively and proactively, and it was a beautiful and effective witness. And so and I look at that and I say, well, where was that? Why do we not have the analog to that in response to this? But this is the question. And it prompts and inspires and really mandates a kind of self-interrogation and practices of confession and then correction and adjustment. So that's
Judge Donnelly?
So Elder Stump, in talking about to each his due, says that after Pentecost, what is due to others is love, which I think is another way of saying right relationship. But I wondered if you had thought about that and her writing about that they're actually the same holistic framework and there's a framework read in the light of the gospel.
Yes.
The same, what is due is love to each other.
Yeah, that's a good comment. In Romans, letter of Romans says, owe one another nothing except for love, right? Similar idea. I mean, the relationship between love and justice is fraught. Every theologian has a different take on it. And in my view, though, if we look at the Sune and the kind of breadth and comprehensive of right relationship, it becomes very similar to what love is. And if love means the constant will or willing the good of others, I think that love is a little bit broader in the sense that I think love has a second meaning, which I think can mean taking delight in something or kind of an affection for something. Like I love ice cream, I love my wife, I love playing basketball. And it's not willing the good of others, it's having affection for it. But if it means willing, in the sense that it means willing the good of others, I actually think it's very close to the Sune when we recognize the breadth of the Sune, which is justice. And the two come together. But I would argue, though, that it involves some obligations that are due or that others have rights to, but others that go beyond. Yes, over here. You want to say your name?
Corbin, my name is Corbin. Thank you all for coming today. It was said earlier that we often find it hard to forgive the insufficient parts of ourselves. And I tend to look at culture as a cohesive element. And it seems like as a culture we're at a point of stagnation, where we're not moving past this issue of polarization, especially in regards to race. And Dr. Rivers, you mentioned that we cannot fully love without knowing the truth. So I wanted to ask you, how do we implement and speed up that process of spreading the truth, especially in the nooks and crannies of culture, so as to get to that point of love? How do we do that?
Good morning, Corbin. Thank you. One of the things that I didn't say, I'm afraid the prospects are bleak. One of the things that I didn't say, in interest of time, was that Carnegie Endowment study found that very few of the countries that got to the level of pernicious polarization were actually able to turn it around. Some were able, maybe for a period of 10 years, but they soon, many of them, not all, soon returned to these high levels of polarization. So that's why I ended with Pope Benedict on prayer. Because I really think that it is a spiritual battle. I think it is extremely difficult. And one other thing I omitted that I would like to speak to. Dan talked about the importance of, that kind of tired, we need to listen to each other. One encouraging result actually is from Braver Angels. Many of you may have heard them. Braver Angels, that they bring together people, you know, left-leaning, liberal, democratic-leaning people to talk with those who are Republican and right-leaning, and according to their website. So, you know, can't always trust self-promotion, but according to their website, 68% of the people that they brought into these conversations left with a positive view of the other side, which seems like enormous progress, and 97% who engaged in one-on-one conversations found some common ground with someone they disagreed with. And that 75% of the people said that they were actually going to spread discuss their experience and the changes they had experienced with family and friends. So it seems to me that intentional conversations bathed in prayer are our best hope to actually move forward. But I want to say, I keep talking about my brother, you know. It's not easy to have those conversations. It's really not easy to have those conversations, especially because I don't think, I mean, when I look at what my brother sends me to try and commend his position, I'm like, I'm not going to watch that YouTube video. And when I send him things, he's like, I don't trust the mainstream media. So because we're in these bubbles and don't agree on the facts, the conversations are even more difficult. I think I need to go to one of these Braver Angels conversations and see how they're doing. Hope that helps.
Well, we can have one more question, and we're taking the liberties to go beyond our time, but I think we can do that. We can ask for forgiveness rather than permission.
Thank you. Thank you for the mercy. And
say your name.
My name is Nathan Beacom. I've had the opportunity over the last year to talk to a number of people who teach theology or philosophy in prison settings. And there's kind of an agreement from talking to these people that prisoners make better students than university students. And, you know, these could be guys who are coming, or gals, whatever the situation is, they might be coming from like opposite gang worlds or whatever, but they're sitting there and like arguing about Abraham Kuyper and like Reformed theology or whatever it is. And there's something, I think, maybe similar with addicts where there's a level of humility and openness that allows them to engage in a more serious way. And I think it's interesting that this restorative justice conversation is linked with the polarization thing. Are there things that we can learn from this reality that's experienced in prison? Like how can we develop and foster that humility to have these conversations amongst the broader public? And could there even be a way that, you know, system impacted people could be part of that? Thank you.
Again, I speak as a teacher and a researcher, not a practitioner. And the practitioners know more and do way more than what I do. But I think what you speak to is actually a very vital insight and kind of a glaring truth, not only in context of incarceration themselves, but many of the people that I researched and interviewed and got to know and have cultivated relationships with as a part of the research for this book were people who were system impacted in various degrees. Many of them were people who'd spent 20 years in prison and had come back into the community centers and the restorative justice work across Chicago and were able to, the primary kind of method they use there are the peacemaking circles, and they integrate peacemaking circles. And peacemaking circles, I just want to say with reference to the last answer, are these remarkable kind of approaches to having these intentional conversations. And they may not always be prayer-bathed or prayer-soaked, but it's kind of, you could legitimately describe it as kind of a lived prayer in a way. It's methodical, it's ritual-esque. There's this kind of intention. It's a set-apart time. But the people who bring the experiences and bring the sense of humility and openness is absolutely fundamental. And so I think what you're pointing to here, would you say maybe 12-step programs of different sorts with people who are recovering from addiction, who have hit rock bottom, or people who have experienced the brokenness. You know, how can we identify and cultivate paths into that kind of humility, but then do that without relying on incarceration and addiction, right? We can learn from this, but we don't need those. Those are not good things. We need to transform those things in the process of learning from them, and maybe in learning from them, that needs to feed into how we transform and change and move forward. So that's my thinking on that. But wonderful question, wonderful observation.
Well, I think we probably have stretched our welcome here, and we've through such a great panel and great questions and conversation. So thank you.